Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and like. The story begins with a scientist named Professor Annie working late in her laboratory. After carrying out a long and difficult experiment, she finally succeeds in creating a mysterious liquid. To test it, she places a cherry on a glass plate and puts a black ant on top of it. Then she carefully pours the special liquid over the setup and seals it with another glass cover. At that moment, one of her assistants enters the lab to remind her about an important meeting. While talking, Annie suddenly notices that the ants are disappearing, one after another. Seeing this result makes her extremely excited, as if her experiment has finally become successful. Soon after, we meet Annie's daughter, Gia, who has successfully passed her university entrance exam. Filled with happiness, she rushes to her mother to share the good news. To celebrate, the two decide to enjoy a relaxing boat trip together. During the outing, they eat delicious food and spend time chatting peacefully. While there, Gia notices another happy family nearby, which reminds her of her own father. Curious, she asks her mother what kind of person he was. Annie smiles softly and tells her that he was a kind and caring man. She explains that he had gone back to Japan for movie shooting and is currently staying in the mountains, which is why he cannot return right now. Gia is surprised and asks if they still keep in touch. Annie replies that they occasionally communicate through emails. A few days later, Annie receives a visit from her old friend, Goro. He hands her an envelope and explains that his elderly neighbor found it during some cleaning. Inside the envelope is an old photograph showing Annie standing beside a young boy. Goro asks if the boy used to be her classmate because he cannot recognize him at all. The moment Annie looks at the picture, memories begin flashing through her mind. For a brief second, she recalls standing beside that boy inside a science laboratory many years ago. However, she quickly hides her emotions and tells Goro that she cannot remember anything about him. After Goro leaves, Annie continues thinking deeply about the mysterious boy in the photograph while walking home from work. Lost in her thoughts, she accidentally drops her handbag onto the road. As she bends down to pick it up, she notices the photograph once again and becomes completely distracted by her memories. Tragically, in that very moment, a car suddenly crashes into her. Not long after the accident, Gia receives a phone call from the hospital informing her about her mother's condition. Shocked and terrified, she immediately rushes there. The doctor explains that Annie was lucky to survive because her injuries are not life-threatening, but she has suffered damage to her brain and may need at least 2 weeks to recover. He also says that she is currently unconscious and nobody knows when she will wake up. Hearing this heartbreaking news leaves Gia devastated. She spends the entire night sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, crying and hoping for her recovery. The following morning, Uncle Gorov learns about Annie's accident and quickly comes to the hospital to support Jaya. He encourages her to take some rest, but she refuses to leave her mother alone. While the two are sitting in the waiting area, a television news report catches their attention. The report talks about a tragic bus accident that happened on March 3rd, 1974. It explains that 36 years earlier, a bus leaving Shinjuku late at night had fallen into a deep ditch, killing 38 passengers. Hearing this news suddenly reminds Gaurav of something from his past. He quietly reveals that he himself was originally supposed to travel on that same bus many years ago. Goro continues explaining that he had once planned to travel on that same bus many years ago. However, because he accidentally forgot his ticket at home, he was not allowed to board. At the time, he felt extremely upset and disappointed. But the following day, when he heard about the terrible accident, realized that fate had actually saved his life. He tells Gia that sometimes painful moments hide unexpected blessings. He comforts her by saying that her mother survived the accident and was not seriously injured, so she should stay strong because everything will eventually be all right. Listening to Goro's words gives Gia a little hope and courage. After some time, she returns home to freshen up. While there, she starts looking through her old birthday albums and eventually opens her mother's email account on the computer. She sends a message to her father, Max, informing him about Annie's accident. Later, she goes back to the hospital and sits beside her unconscious mother with tears in her eyes. Quietly, she tells her, "Mom, today is my 18th birthday." A short while later, Annie suddenly regains consciousness. The moment she wakes up, she urgently tells Gia that she must go and meet someone named Ken. Annie explains that inside her handbag, there is a photograph of both her and Ken, along with the key to a drawer in her laboratory. She begs Gia to fulfill this request as if it were her final wish. Annie then reveals that inside the drawer are 2 small vials containing a special liquid capable of time travel. She instructs Gia to drink the liquid while focusing on a specific date, a Saturday in April 1972, the day she and Ken were together inside their junior high school science lab. Annie says that Gia must deliver an important message to Ken on her behalf. Before losing consciousness again, Annie leans closer and whispers something privately into Gia's ear, though the audience cannot hear what she says. We are left wondering about the secret message she wants delivered. Moments later, Annie faints once again. Determined to fulfill her mother's wish, Gia immediately heads to the laboratory and follows every instruction carefully. She places the photograph of Annie and Ken in front of her, drinks the mysterious liquid, and repeatedly concentrates on the words Saturday, April 1972. At first, nothing seems to happen. Gia even laughs nervously, thinking perhaps the experiment was fake. Then she suddenly questions herself, wondering if she remembered the date correctly. In the next instant, the hands of her wristwatch begin spinning wildly, and she realizes something impossible is happening. Time itself starts pulling her backwards. Confused and frightened, Gia is suddenly transported into the past, where she crashes directly into a young man inside a science laboratory. The next morning, Gia wakes up in an unfamiliar room belonging to a boy named Ron. The story then reveals what happened after her arrival. When she first fell onto him during the time jump, she mistakenly believed he was Ken. However, the boy quickly corrected her and introduced himself as Ron. Confused, Gia asked whether the place was the junior high school science lab from her mother's memories. Ron explained that it was actually Shutoku University, not a junior high school. Shocked by this unexpected answer, Gia fainted immediately, forcing Ron to bring her back to his room to recover. Once she regains consciousness, Gia anxiously asks Ron about the current date. He calmly tells her that it is Saturday, February 17th, 1974. Unable to believe him, Gia checks the calendars and magazines around the room and realizes he is telling the truth. That is when she understands what went wrong. Instead of traveling to 1972 as intended, she accidentally arrived 2 years later in 1974. Panicking, she quickly rushes out of the room, though she accidentally leaves her bag behind. Ron notices and chases after her to return it. Together, they eventually arrive at a junior high school. Gia shows the students the photograph of Annie and Ken, asking if anyone recognizes the boy beside her mother. Unfortunately, the students only recognize Annie and have no idea who Ken is. This leaves Gia frustrated and disappointed. Wanting to help, Ron later takes her out for breakfast. While eating, he asks where her home is and tells her that her parents must be worried about her. He offers to take her back after they finish eating. Finally, Gia decides to tell him the shocking truth. She explains that she has come from the future in search of a man named Ken. Ron finds Gia's story impossible to believe at first. He laughs and says that things like time travel only happen in movies. In response, Gia explains that she actually came from the year 2010. She reminds him that he saw her suddenly appear out of nowhere inside the laboratory. To prove that she is telling the truth, she takes out modern coins and her mobile phone from her bag. Although the phone has no network connection in the past, she demonstrates that it can still take pictures, work as a flashlight, and perform many other functions. Ron becomes fascinated while looking at the strange device and admits that he once imagined something similar while working on a film project. Despite this, Ron slowly becomes frightened of Gia. Her sudden appearance and futuristic belongings make him think she might not even be human. Nervously, he tries to distance himself from her, joking that she feels more like an alien than a normal girl. Desperate for help, Gia begs him to let her stay with him for a while. She promises to cook, clean, and help with everything in the house if he allows her to remain there. However, Ron initially refuses. Gia then tells him the heartbreaking truth about her mother's accident in the future. She explains that her mother's final wish was for her to find a man named Ken and deliver an important message to him. With tears in her eyes, she pleads with Ron to help her complete this mission, promising that once she succeeds, she will never trouble him again. After thinking about it for some time, Ron finally agrees to help her. The next day, Ron and Gia secretly enter Annie's old junior high school to search through student records from 2 years earlier. While going through the files, they successfully find a photograph of young Annie. The picture clearly shows that Annie and Ken studied in the same class and even wore the same school uniform. However, despite searching carefully, they find absolutely no information about Ken anywhere in the school records. This mystery leaves Gia confused and frustrated. Suddenly, Gia comes up with another idea. She decides that if she can find Annie's old address from the records, she might be able to meet her younger self directly and ask about Ken. At first, the plan sounds perfect. However, when they finally reach the address, they discover that the house is completely empty and locked. Nobody lives there anymore. While standing nearby, Gia notices a young boy who looks strangely familiar. Without thinking, she accidentally calls out, "Uncle Goro!" The boy immediately stops and stares at her in confusion, wondering why a stranger is calling him uncle. Embarrassed, Gia quickly apologizes and says the word slipped out by mistake. She then introduces herself as Annie's cousin and asks him if he knows where Annie is living now. Goro explains that Annie moved to Yokohama 2 years earlier. He is surprised that her so-called cousin does not already know this information. Gia awkwardly explains that she had been away for a very long time, which is why she lost contact. The following day, Goro finally provides Gia with Annie's school address. Excited and nervous, she immediately heads there. Once she arrives, she shows the photograph and begins asking about Ken. At that moment, young Annie has no idea that the mysterious girl standing in front of her is actually her own daughter from the future. Young Annie carefully looks at the photograph and admits that the girl in the picture is definitely her, but she cannot remember when it was taken or who the boy beside her is. As she struggles to recall the memory, she suddenly begins feeling dizzy. Not wanting to pressure her any further, Gia gently tells Annie not not to force herself. She says that she will return the next day and asks Annie to let her know if she remembers anything in the meantime. Later, Ron takes Gia to the house of his close friend Max, who works as a photographer. The moment they arrive, Gia becomes extremely embarrassed after accidentally seeing Max bathing without clothes. Surprisingly, Max acts completely normal and does not seem awkward at all. Mistaking Gia for Ron's girlfriend, he jokingly asks about their relationship. Nervous, Ron quickly lies and says that she is actually his cousin. After getting dressed, Max joins Ron for drinks while discussing their latest film project. As the night goes on, both friends become heavily drunk. They spend hours laughing, crying, talking emotionally, and sharing their dreams about life and the future. During this time, Gia starts looking through some of the photographs Max has taken. Suddenly, she discovers a picture of her mother, Annie. The moment she sees it, she realizes something shocking. This photographer, Max, is destined to become her father in the future. Quietly, she keeps the photograph with her without telling anyone. The next day, Gia meets Annie once again, but Annie still cannot remember anything about Ken. Hoping to learn more, Gia shows Annie the photograph taken by Max and asks whether she knows the man in it. Annie smiles and explains that his name is Max. She says that she recently met him through a friend and that he works as a photographer who took her picture. At this point, Gia has already met both her mother and father in the past, yet Ken remains completely missing. The mystery surrounding him becomes even stranger, almost as if he never truly existed, or perhaps came from another time himself. Determined not to give up, Gia comes up with a new plan. She decides to publish Ken's photograph in the newspaper so that anyone who recognizes him can contact them. She even thinks that if Ken somehow belongs to the future, the newspaper records would still exist later, giving him a chance to find them himself. However, there is one major problem. Publishing an advertisement in the newspaper costs 500 yen, while Ron only has 400. Desperate, they visit the newspaper office and spend several minutes negotiating with the seller. Eventually, the man agrees to lower the price and gives them a discount. The following day, Ron and Max continue shooting their film project together. During a quiet moment, Max privately tells Gia that he already knows she is not really Ron's cousin. He reveals that he will soon leave for the United States to study photography. Before leaving, he asks her to look after Ron. Gia then shows Max Annie's photograph and asks whether he would still go abroad if Annie asked him to stay. She wonders if he is worried about losing her in the future. Max calmly replies that Annie would never stop him from following his dream. He explains that Annie is a strong and understanding person who would encourage him to chase his passion, even if it meant being far away from her. Before the conversation can continue further, someone suddenly calls Max away, leaving their discussion unfinished. Later, after the film shooting is completed, everyone begins celebrating together. During the celebration, Gia notices Annie standing nearby. She takes the opportunity to speak with her privately and asks why she is not trying to stop Max from leaving for America if she truly loves him. Gia warns her that if Max goes away, their future together could become painful and uncertain. Annie listens quietly before giving a thoughtful reply. She explains that she is happy living in the present moment and does not want to ruin that happiness by constantly worrying about the future. According to her, enjoying the time they currently share together is more important than fearing what may happen later. After saying this, Annie says goodbye and leaves with Max. Watching them walk away, Gia turns toward Ron and teasingly asks why he allowed her to stay with him in the first place. Before Ron can answer, she jokingly says that he probably never had the courage to refuse her anyway. Gia continues teasing Ron playfully, calling herself adorable and jokingly flirting with him. Then her tone suddenly becomes more emotional. She tells Ron that in the future he will grow into a successful film director, marry a beautiful actress, and have a happy family with wonderful children. She says that one day he will probably forget all about her, and she will become nothing more than a distant memory from the past. Finally, she softly asks whether he would even recognize her if they ever met again in the future. Hearing these words deeply affects Ron. Tears begin filling his eyes, though he tries to hide his emotions. That same night, he rushes to Max's house and asks to borrow his camera equipment. Ron decides that he wants Gia to appear in the final scenes of his movie so he can preserve the memory of her forever and never allow himself to forget her. The next day, Ron films several scenes featuring Gia. Around the same time, the newspaper advertisement they placed about Ken finally gets published. Far away in the future, a man named Ken notices the same advertisement on his futuristic device. According to Ken, he does not belong to 2010 or even 1974. In reality, he comes from the distant year 2698. The message in the advertisement states that someone will be waiting for him on March 3rd, 1974, inside the science laboratory of his old junior high school. Meanwhile, tragedy strikes Ron's life. On March 2nd, he receives a heartbreaking phone call from his mother informing him that his father has passed away. The news completely shatters him. Crying uncontrollably, Ron blames himself for everything. He explains to Gia that while his father struggled financially and fought hard to keep his business alive, he selfishly left home to chase his dream of filmmaking. Now his father has died from a stroke while carrying all those burdens alone. Consumed by guilt, Ron declares that he no longer wants to continue working on his film and refuses even to edit the footage they shot together. Gia tries her best to comfort him and reminds him how much effort and time he already invested into his dream. However, Ron is too overwhelmed with regret and sadness to listen. The following day, Gia heads to the junior high school science lab to wait for Ken. She waits there anxiously for a long time, but he never appears. Slowly, she begins losing hope. While sitting there, a glass object suddenly slips from her hand and starts falling. Strangely, before it can shatter, it freezes in midair as though time itself has stopped. In that exact moment, Ken finally appears before her. To Gia's surprise, Ken looks completely different from the boy in the old photograph. Confused, he asks who she is and why she wanted to meet him. Gia then reveals everything. She explains that she is Annie's daughter from the future and tells him about her mother's accident in 2010. She says that Annie's final wish was for her to deliver an important message to the boy in the photograph, a boy named Ken. Gia repeats the message her mother wanted him to hear. Annie remembered the promise he once made to her. Curious and emotional, Gia asks Ken what exactly that promise was. Ken finally reveals the truth behind his identity. He explains that he actually comes from the year 2698 and that many years ago he invented a liquid capable of time travel. Wanting to test the experiment on himself, he accidentally traveled back to 1972, where he met Annie. During his stay in the past, the two of them spent several days together and eventually fell deeply in love. However, because he had to return to his own era, he was also forced to erase the memories of everyone connected to him in the past. When Ken informed Annie about this, she became heartbroken and emotional. Before leaving, he promised her that someday he would return to meet her again in the future. Unfortunately, after going back to his own time, life became so busy that he never fulfilled that promise. Now, after all these years, Ken says he is finally ready to see Annie once again. However, Gia stops him and says she needs a little more time before he meets her mother. She explains that there is still someone very important she wants to say goodbye to properly. After this, she contacts Ron and asks him to come meet her because her mission has finally been completed. Ron tells Gia that he is leaving for his hometown that very day and plans to return the next morning. He says that once he comes back, they will watch the film they created together, although some voice dubbing work is still unfinished. Ron promises that after returning from home, he will continue improving the movie. Before leaving, he hands Gia the film reel and asks her to keep it safe. As Ron prepares to leave, Gia suddenly hugs him tightly and bursts into tears. Deep inside, she knows this may be the last time they ever see each other. However, she cannot bring herself to tell him the truth, that she must soon return to the future and disappear from his life forever. Unable to say goodbye properly, she silently watches him leave for the bus station. On her way back to Ron's room, Gia unexpectedly runs into young Goro, who is rushing home in panic. When she asks what happened, he explains that he forgot his bus ticket at home and will miss his trip if he does not retrieve it quickly. Hearing this immediately reminds Gia of the story Uncle Goro told her years later in the hospital waiting room. He had once said that missing that bus ultimately saved his life because the vehicle later crashed and killed many passengers. Realizing this, Gia understands that Goro must not board the bus at any cost. At first, she tells him there is no need to rush, but then another terrifying thought strikes her. Ron is also traveling on that same bus tonight. Suddenly panicking, Gia runs desperately through the streets, trying to stop him before the accident happens. However, before she can reach the bus, Ken suddenly appears and blocks her path. He warns her not to interfere with the past because changing history could have dangerous consequences. He insists that it is finally time for her to return to the future, but Gia refuses to give up so easily. In desperation, she breaks the second vial containing the time travel liquid and continues chasing after Ron's bus while screaming his name. Sadly, Ron never hears her cries. The bus drives away into the night, leaving Gia standing there helpless and heartbroken. Tears stream down her face as she realizes there's nothing more she can do. At that moment, Ken uses his powers to erase all of Gia's memories connected to the time travel journey. Immediately afterward, he sends her back to the year 2010. When Gia regains consciousness, she finds herself back in her own room as though nothing ever happened. Meanwhile, Annie finally wakes up in the hospital and Ken appears beside her. Smiling gently, he reminds Annie that he kept the promise he made so many years ago. The two spend some quiet and emotional moments together before Ken once again erases Annie's memories and returns to his own era. Later, Gia arrives at the hospital and is overjoyed to see that her mother is finally awake and healthy again. Yet, despite her happiness, she feels a strange sadness deep inside her heart. She cannot explain why she feels so empty, because all her memories of Ron and the journey through time have disappeared. A few days later, Gia discovers Ron's old film reel hidden inside her bag. Curious to know what it contains, she decides to watch it. Since the reel requires an old-fashioned projector, she contacts her father, Max, and asks him to bring one. Max had already received the email Gia sent after Annie's accident, so he was planning to visit them anyway. He arrives with the projector as requested. One day, Jaya and a few friends gather together to watch the silent film. As the movie movie plays, they watch all the scenes Ron created. In the final sequence, Gia briefly appears on screen, though Ron had secretly filmed her from behind while leaving, which is why she cannot recognize herself properly. Still, for some mysterious reason, tears begin flowing uncontrollably from her eyes. Even her friends are confused, assuming the film is simply an old science fiction project. They cannot understand why it affects her so deeply. After the film ends, they discover a note hidden inside the reel box. The message from Ron says that after 36 years, cherry blossoms will bloom at the location where the final scene was filmed, and they should meet there again after all that time. Confused but emotionally drawn to the place, Gia eventually visits the location alone. Just as Ron had written, beautiful cherry blossoms are blooming there after 36 years. However, Ron himself never arrives. Unknown to Gia, he had died in the tragic bus accident on the night of March 3rd, 1974. Because her memories were erased, she cannot remember any of the love, pain, or sacrifice connected to him. All she feels is a strange emptiness in her heart that she cannot explain. And with that bittersweet and heartbreaking ending, the story comes to a close. In the end, the two souls who cared deeply for each other were never truly able to reunite again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and share it with your friends. We'll be back again with another amazing story very soon. Until then, take care of yourselves and thank you so much for watching.